Hi guys, today we're going to be looking at chapter 4 of the Ecce Romani textbook titled A Mischief Maker. In this chapter, you're going to follow the mischief maker, whose name's Sextus, and you're going to be reading about his attempt to scare Cornelia. The grammar for this chapter is going to be learning how to identify direct objects in Latin. How can you tell the difference between transitive and intransitive verbs, and how you mark up the grammar of a Latin sentence, which we call the core elements. So again, in order to successfully understand the story in this chapter, we really need to start with the vocabulary. And again, we want to start with derivatives when looking at this vocabulary, as it's going to be the key to helping us apply it back to our daily lives in English. So let's start with the word molestus. This is a Latin adjective that means troublesome or annoying. And from this word in English, we get molest and molestation. Now, both of these English words have a really negative connotation, and it had that meaning in Latin too, but you can see that at their core they stem from this concept of being troublesome or annoying, and their spelling is still holding on to that Latin root as well. The next word, semper, is where we get a really famous phrase in the American military, which is semper fi, which is a shortened form of semper fidelis, which means always faithful. And this is the motto of the U.S. Marine Corps. The semper part is what means always here. And we see it in the Romance languages too, in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. With sempre or siempre in Spanish, you can see that same root of semper, which means always across these other Romance languages. The word vexat in Latin means he or she annoys. And in English, we get the words vex and vexation from this. And if you've ever heard someone say they're vexed, what they're really saying is that they're troubled or annoyed at something. And it's coming from this root of the verb vexare, which means to annoy in Latin. And it's holding on to that meaning in English as well. Amat means he or she loves in Latin. And this is a really basic root that we get words like amatory, amor, right? And even the name Amanda. They all come from this root of loving. And so amatory in English is an adjective that means loving, right? It has to do with love. Same with amor and again Amanda. They all come from this root of love in the Romance languages too. Dormit means he or she sleeps. And it's where you get in English words like dormitory, dormant, dormancy, even dormouse. They all have to do with sleeping. So the dormitory is a place where someone sleeps. And if, say, a volcano is called dormant, it means it's sleeping or it's inactive. But the implication is that at some point it might wake up and explode, right? So all four of these English words are coming from the Latin root of sleeping. Conspicit is a word in English that leads to conspicuous. And it has to do with sort of drawing attention to yourself. And it comes from this word conspicere, which means to catch sight of. So if you're acting conspicuous, it means you're behaving in a way that's going to draw attention to yourself, or someone is going to notice you. That's what it means to be conspicuous in English. And furtum in Latin is a word for stealthy, and it's where you get furtive or furtively in English. They're holding that same root in Latin of being stealthy. They mean the same thing in English. From the Latin word ascendit, which means he or she climbs, we get the words ascend and ascent in English. And both of these hold on to that concept of climbing or going up something. If you think of climbing a mountain, you might say, I've ascended a mountain. Or if you're in the process of climbing, you might say, I'm making my ascent. Both of these are holding on to that Latin meaning of climbing or going up. Magnus is a Latin adjective, and the root gives us words in English like magnify, magnitude, magnificent, magnanimous, and even magnate. They all have that same M-A-G-N root, which means great or large. And if you think of magnifying something, if you take a magnifying glass, you're making the image bigger. And the same thing with, magnanimous. It means you have sort of a great spirit type idea, or magnificent. They all have to do with being great. And again, same with magnate and magnitude. So they're all holding on to this Latin root of magnus. From audit, we get audible, audience, audit, which is the same spelling. We get audition and auditory, and even words like auditorium. They're all holding on to this root of hearing. So audit means he or she hears. And if you think of an audible in football, you know, if a quarterback calls an audible, it means they're changing the play. You have to hear that audible. You're listening to something to understand. And it's the same idea with an audience. The audience is the crowd of people who are listening to a speaker or listening to something. If you go to an audition, you're going to be performing and someone will be listening to you, right? And in most cases, judging you on something. And it's the same word as auditorium. That's the place you go to listen to something. The word videt means he or she sees in Latin. And in English, we get words like evident, evidence. We also get view, television, vision, and even the word revise. They're all coming from this root of videt. And it's a verb of seeing, and in English, it's holding on to this meaning. So if you think of the word view, for instance, it's talking about what you can see. The word vision is another word for your sight, and a television is something that you watch. And if you think even of the word revise in English, it means you're looking at something again when you revise it. So vox in Latin is a word that means voice, and it gives us a variety of English words that have to do with speaking or using your voice, such as vocal, vocalize, vociferous, and even vowel. These all have to do with your voice. So when you're being vocal, you're speaking up. And when you vocalize something, you know, you're using your voice. That's the root of all these words. Terret is a word that means he or she scares or frightens. And it's where we get the words terrible, terrific, terrify, terror, terrorist, and deter. They all come from this same root of frightening someone. So if you terrify someone, it's got the root right in it for frightening or scaring. Same with terror, terrible. They're all holding on to this root. And if you think of the word deter, it's usually talking about being afraid of something. So if you deter someone, it's almost holding this same root that, you know, if I'm deterring you from cheating on a test, I'm sort of threatening you with punishment to keep you from doing it. The idea is that you'll be afraid to do it. So that's where the root is coming from. In Latin, nihil means nothing. And in English, we get a couple of words from this, such as nihilism, annihilate, and nil. And they all mean nothing. So if you watch, European soccer, for instance, you might hear nil, which means 0, when they're talking about a score. It means nothing. It's a shortened version. And when you annihilate something, it means you're destroying it completely so that nothing remains. There's nothing left. And you can spot this nihil root in all three of these words pretty easily. So it'll be good to remember the word nothing. It'll help you remember this. Infirmus is a word that means weak or shaky in our chapter. And in English, the words we get from it are infirmary, infirm, and infirmity. And if you think of it in this case, in our chapter, they're going to be talking about a weak branch. But if you're thinking of a person, when you're weak, you're really sick. And the infirmary is another word for, like a nurse's office or a hospital. It's where you go when you're sick. All three of these words are holding on to that root of infirmus in Latin. And if you think about it, it means weak, and you can tell why, because it has the word firm right in it, which is a word for strong. All the in is doing here is making it a negative. So in other words, infirmus means not strong, which is where we get weak from. So for the grammar in this chapter, we're going to be looking at direct objects and the ending M. And this is something that an understanding of English grammar will help you a lot with. But once we master this material, you'll be able to recognize what a direct object is very easily, and you'll be able to form more complex sentences that involve actions being done by one person to another person. So let's look at direct objects. And you want to remember that in Latin and English, the subject of the sentence is the person, place, or thing that performs the action. So we studied that a couple chapters ago. That's the subject. So if I give you the sentence, I throw the pen, you want to try to figure out where the subject is. And we can see here the subject is I. So in other words, the person performing the action is I. So you can ask yourself, who is throwing? I am throwing. The direct object in Latin and in English is the person or thing that receives the action. So if the subject performs the action, the direct object receives the action. So let's go back to our sentence, I throw the pen. We already know that the subject is. Now we know that the subject is performing an action. It's throwing something. So throw becomes our verb. Is we have to ask ourselves who or what is receiving the action. So in other words, who is receiving the action of the throwing? And the way you want to word this in English is you want to put it all together. I throw who or I throw what? And the answer in this case is the pen. This is our direct object. You're saying I throw what? I'm throwing the pen. In other words, the person or thing that is being thrown or receiving the action is the pen. The subject is I. It's performing an action of throwing. And the thing being thrown is the pen. That's what we call a direct object in English and in Latin. And in Latin, we can really easily recognize direct objects when they're singular by looking for the ending M. So in this case, we have sextus corneliam vexat, and we can see that corneliam ends in an M, which is a new ending for us. Usually we've seen it with an A. This is telling us that Cornelia is the direct object of this sentence. Cornelia is the person being annoyed, receiving the action. And in that case, we know that the person performing the action has to be sextus. Cornelia can't be the subject and the direct object. So the only thing left is sextus, which makes sense because it ends in that US ending, which tells us it's the subject. And the action being performed, of course, is vexat, which means he or she annoys. So when you put it all together, we have sextus annoys Cornelia. So let's look at the word order of this sentence, because it's a really important idea in English and in Latin. So if we look at the English sentence, we have sextus annoys Cornelia. We have our subject, which is sextus. We have our verb, which is annoys. And we have our direct object, which is Cornelia. So we can see sextus annoys Cornelia. In English, we can tell this is the meaning of the sentence because there's a standard word order of subject, verb, direct object. It always works that way. The first person listed here is subject, sextus. The verb comes next, and it's always followed by a direct object. Let's look at the Latin form of this, though. Sextus corneliam vexat. And the first thing we notice is that the subject again is sextus. Corneliam is the direct object, though. So Cornelia is the direct object here, and it's followed by the verb of vexat. So the question is, how does this make sense? Because we've changed the word order. So in English, it goes subject, verb, direct object. But in Latin, we have subject, direct object, verb. Shouldn't this mean that the subject or the sentence doesn't make any sense? You would think so in English, but in Latin, it actually makes perfect sense. We can switch the word order again and make it Corneliam vexat sextus, which if we put it into English, it would say Cornelia annoys sextus if we took it, in that subject, verb, direct object order. But if we look at the endings, we can see Corneliam has to be the direct object. Vexat has to be the verb, and sextus has to be the subject. Even though we've switched the word order around, it means the exact same thing. Sextus annoys Cornelia. Let's try it one more time. Now we have vexat sextus corneliam. And again, we see vexat is the verb, sextus is the subject, and corneliam is the direct object. We've completely changed the word order, and it still makes sense in Latin. It's because of the endings. So just to make this a little bit more obvious, look at the English. If we change the word order in English from Sextus annoys Cornelia to Cornelia annoys Sextus, we've changed the entire meaning of the sentence. That one little switch has changed the subject from Sextus to Cornelia. Let's look at the Latin though. In Latin we don't have a problem with this because of the ending. The three forms that we used, Sextus Corneliam vexat, Corneliam vexat Sextus, and vexat Sextus Corneliam all mean the same thing. They all mean Sextus annoys Cornelia. And the reason for this is because of the endings. If you look at the endings of these words, you can always figure out which one's the subject, which one's the verb, and which one is the direct object. This is a really fundamental aspect of how Latin works, and you want to remember this moving forward. There's a lot of freedom in the word order of Latin sentences. They don't have to be the same way we write it in English. And the key to understanding it always comes back to knowing the endings of these nouns and adjectives as well as the verbs. The second part of the grammar for chapter 4 is transitive and intransitive verbs. So let's take a look at the different definitions between transitive and intransitive verbs. To start, a transitive verb is a verb that takes a direct object, meaning it has a direct object that specifically goes with that verb. Intransitive verbs are the exact opposite. They don't have a direct object. This is the basic distinction between the two of them. It sounds simple, and it is. It gets more complicated when you're trying to take sentences apart to figure this out, but the definition is pretty simple, and we want to just keep track of that as we go. If we use the example Sextus Corneliam vexat, we can break it apart just like we have been doing. Sextus is your subject, vexat is the verb, and we know from the M ending that Corneliam has to be the direct object, and we know that now because of that M. So now we have the core elements of this Latin sentence, the subject, direct object, and the verb. Now that we know that Corneliam is the direct object, we know that vexat has to be a transitive verb, and the reason for that is that the direct object is going right along with it. It's saying Sextus annoys who? Cornelia. The direct object of Corneliam is going with vexat. So we can switch this to a TV to mark it as a transitive verb. Let's take a look at a different example. So let's try this sentence. Cornelia sub arbore sedet. Cornelia sits under the tree. The first thing we want to find is our verb, which we can identify as sedet. So now we want to say, okay, who's sitting? And the answer is Cornelia, which gives us our subject. The next question we always want to figure out is whether or not the verb is transitive or intransitive. And to do that, we have to ask our questions that go with direct objects, which are who and what. So in this case, we want to ask the question, Cornelia sits who or Cornelia sits what? If we have an answer to that makes sense, we have a direct object. And we can see here that the only part of the sentence we have left to apply these questions is sub arbore. So if we ask the questions, Cornelia sits who and Cornelia sits what, is the answer under the tree? No, that doesn't make any sense. So we know these questions are out and we don't have a direct object here. What we do have is a prepositional phrase that's telling us where. But since that doesn't qualify as a direct object, we know that sedet is not a transitive verb. Therefore, we mark it with an IV, it's intransitive, and we can move on. Just a helpful hint. Whenever you're marking up the core elements of a Latin sentence, you want to remember that prepositional phrases, and those are a phrase that shows position and contains a preposition such as under, above, over, these prepositional phrases are never direct objects. Direct objects answer the question who or what in relation to the verb, while prepositional phrases answer the question where. So for instance, let's take a look at the sentence Cornelia sub arbore sedet. Here, the sub arbore is the prepositional phrase. It's showing us a position of being under the tree. Since that's a prepositional phrase, we know this sentence does not have a direct object, and therefore the verb sedet is intransitive. So let's put this all together into a more complicated example. Cornelia in villa sedet quod defessa est, or Cornelia sits in the house because she's tired. Let's start with the first part here, the first clause. And we want to be asking, where's the verb? And we find it in sedet. That's our action word, he or she sits. Now we want to ask, who sits? And the answer is Cornelia. That's our subject. Now we have the phrase in villa, which we should recognize as being a prepositional phrase, so we leave it alone. And if you wanted to double check, you know that there's no M on the end, which is a red flag, and also it doesn't answer the questions who or what. So in other words, if we said Cornelia sits what, the answer is not in the house. That doesn't make any sense. So this is an intransitive verb, sedet. It doesn't have a direct object. The second part we need to look at is quod defessa est, because she is tired. And we have to find the verb again. In this case, it's a linking verb, the verb to be, which is est. So we mark it with an LV. And remember, whenever you have a linking verb, you want to look for a complement. In this case, it's defessa. It's the adjective that describes Cornelia. Cornelia is tired. That's the complement here. When we put it all together, we get Cornelia sits in the house because she is tired. That sentence has an intransitive verb in sedet, a linking verb with est, and a complement in defessa. Doing this to Latin sentences is great practice. Again, if you can diagram all these core elements, you can see the pieces and how they fit together, and it will help you translate the sentence.